While artificial intelligence tools can be very helpful for us in so many different ways, there are some ethical implications to using these tools. And in this video, I'll explore some of the ethical considerations that need to be kept in mind. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about 5 big ethical considerations, and they're around the ideas of privacy and confidentiality, hallucinations and incorrect data. We're also exploring fairness and bias in AI tools, which then leads to the notion of transparency. And then we'll end the video by looking at the global impact of these AI tools. All right, let's get started. So let's begin with privacy and confidentiality. Now, under privacy and confidentiality itself, we can look at 3 different categories of issues. So we've got the considerations of intellectual property and how that is affected by AI tools. We've also have to think through collection and storage of sensitive materials because AI tools depend on vast amounts of data. So where is this data coming from? Where are we keeping it? Who owns it? Are questions that we need to think through. And then, of course, there's also this concept of informed consent, right? When we have all of this data, have people consented to its use? So let's take each of these individually and break them down. So when we talk about intellectual property itself, well, AI has an intellectual property problem. And this was an article that came out in 2023, so right at the beginning when ChatGPT came out. Because what people discovered is the fact that ChatGPT had been trained on data that was available on the internet, that's freely available on the internet. And ChatGPT was then taking that, synthesizing it, and then pushing that data information out to other people in different formats, right? And so it was pulling from other people's copyrighted intellectual property, but it was not crediting them for it. And that is a problem. So when we come to image generators like Midjourney, they were taking their ideas and concepts from the work of other artists that were available on the internet. And so again, where are they drawing it from? Nothing was credited to the artists or to the writers or to the newspapers where it was drawn from. And so that is an intellectual property problem that all our large language models and generative AI have. And we need to think about that as we're using this, right? There are court cases that are still going on from different news organizations, authors, artist groups who have sued ChatGPT, OpenAI over these intellectual issues. But at this point in time, we're having the usual issue of technology being way ahead of legislation. So we're going to have to figure out where they fit in. Something similar to this happened when Google started with its search engine, and it was pulling all the data from websites. And in that case, it was ruled that Google could do that. And so that kind of forms a precedent that OpenAI is playing on. But for us as users, we do have to think about intellectual property, because how does that affect you? You putting your information out there, right? You might have written something, and if it is openly available, well, these tools can pull them. They can scrape them from the web and then use them in different ways. So that's an intellectual property issue that needs to be considered. Okay. The next one is of course, privacy and confidentiality. And this one is with collection of sensitive materials, right? So when we're taking data from people, where is it saved? How is it being saved? And who has access to this data? Now, this of course, has a lot of implications in healthcare. And there was this article in 2024 in the context of higher education, but their takeaways apply to the healthcare industry and just broadly anyone using these AI tools. So ML stands for machine learning, which is the AI category that takes in large data sets and analyzes them, right? So what are the data privacy policies? And do we have a common privacy policy that everyone has to adhere to? And when we have these policies, who has helped in drafting the policies, right? Is it being written by the technology company themselves or by technologists, or do common lay people like the practitioners, your clinicians, your patients, do they all have a voice in how the policy is being shaped as well? And then we need to think about where the data is housed as well. So if you take, for example, a healthcare industry, a hospital, right? You're getting all of this patient information. Now, where is it? What server is it on? Who has access to that server? Does it have enough security that it cannot be breached by hackers? So all of those are things that we need to think through, and our technology companies should take ownership over how they're going to be doing this, and this should be done consciously. We cannot just take people's data without being responsible for that data either. And when we get data from people, where does the ownership go now? Is it still the person's data? Is it my data? Is it some other organization's data? Now, are questions that we need to think through, which is where the policy implications come in. And then, of course, we have informed consent. So with informed consent and healthcare, right, it becomes a little interesting over here. Informed consent in the sense of, do we need to let our patients know that the diagnosis we're coming up with has been helped by AI tools, right? For example, I used ChatGPT to come up with this diagnosis. Do I need to tell my patient that? And so the study that was done on that and came out last April is that patients do want that transparency. And interestingly enough, when doctors have that transparency, patients tend to trust that information, the one that was AI informed, they trust that a little bit more than just regular information. However, they're not willing to just take the AI information by itself. They do want the mediation of the doctor in the middle. So that's where we are right now, right? In this study, the patients were comfortable when the doctor told them, well, I did consult all of these AI tools, and based on that, this is my diagnosis for you. Patients seem to be comfortable with that. So that would also fall under informed consent, along with, can I use your data for XYZ, right? But in the healthcare industry, we kind of get a blanket statement for that when they come into healthcare itself and they sign all those forms. So all of those implications also need to be thought through when we're working with AI itself. If we were thinking about it in terms of research, what would be important to consider is, do we need to tell our patients or our participants that the data they're giving us will be fed into an AI tool for analysis, right? Do we need to disclose that? Are questions that are now being debated. My personal take on it is, we're debating it now. I don't think it's going to remain much of an issue moving forward, simply because these AI tools are now bundled within the other software itself. So when I use SPSS, it has AI features built into it. If I use a qualitative research tool, it has AI features built into it. Now, I'm not going to be telling my participants I will be using SPSS version X, Y, and Z and these functionalities in it when I analyze the data. We don't disclose all that. And so I think we're going to be moving towards that, where we don't need to disclose those things to our research participants. Okay, now let's move to the other big category of ethical considerations, which is hallucinations and incorrect data. But let's think about what is a hallucination and why does it do it, right? So candidly, you could think of hallucinations as, these basic incorrect facts or just lies that generative AI seems to be producing, right? And it's primarily in the context of large language models. So why does it do that? Now, these large language models were trained on data they had access to. So most of them had access to coding data from open source platforms like GitHub. A lot of them drew from Reddit. And so they're very well trained on coding information, and they're extremely good at that. Now let's think about academic journals. These journals are behind a paywall, which means these tools did not have access to a large body of academic journals. Therefore, when you ask them to pull up a bibliography or do a literature review, well, they don't have access to that material. So how are they going to give you a very accurate bibliography? That's going to be a little difficult. And that's where hallucinations will become very obvious. So since they don't have access to that data, they generally tend to fill in the gaps with what they think would be the most appropriate response over there. They never say that the concept of I don't know does not exist for these tools. They never tell you just that they don't know. They instead try to fill in the gaps with possible responses, which is where we call them hallucinations, because it's making so many errors. And we have to be careful and check the data that these tools provide. So let's look at some examples of hallucinations, some really famous examples, right? One of them is a teacher. For the whole class, the teacher went and accused them of using ChatGPT. Now, one of the most flawed technologies we have right now is these anti-AI checkers. Really need to be careful about how we're using them, because they are not really that great. So before you do things like this, you want to be careful about it. The other place where hallucination happens is, like I mentioned, when you use ChatGPT to generate sources for research. Not good. And one of the most famous hallucinations, incorrect information that came, was from Google Bard and Google Gemini now, when they were first introducing it on stage, and it made errors in the facts that it was reporting. So that was like this big boo-boo on stage kind of thing. But again, hallucinations from them. And the other one that was also there, some of you might have heard of this, a lawyer was pulled up by the judge because he had cited a lot of legal precedents that never existed, and the ChatGPT had just made them up. Other than that, you also have fun examples of asking ChatGPT, can I walk, how long will it take me to walk across the English Channel? And it'll actually give you a response of how many hours or whatever, when in reality you cannot walk across the English Channel, right? Fairly recently, there was this whole thing that was going around about one of these tools telling you to eat stones because that was good for your health. So it's just various random things that these tools come up with. And again, depends on what kind of questions you're asking them. But for everything, remember, it has to be verified. And so this is a consideration when you're using these tools. Okay, let's talk about fairness and bias. And this element of it is directly related to the algorithms that work behind these tools. And this is beyond just your large language models. It has to do with all AI tools. And I'll talk through some of these examples now. So your AI tools, basically, they're taking a large amount of data, they're processing it based on certain criteria, and they're giving you responses. Okay, now it's that processing element of it, which is where you have the algorithm, right? And the criteria that you're giving it to process. If that criteria is not well developed, it can give rise to a lot of bias. And that's one way of getting bias into your data. The other way is the data going into the system itself is wrong. And so then what do you get out? It's garbage in, garbage out, right? If these systems were being trained on the internet is full of flawed data. And so they were taking in a whole lot of garbage along with all the stereotypes that come with it. They all got built into these systems. And so that was the other element of bias, where it's just because of the data that came in, what it puts out right now is biased. The other way of you could have bias is in the prompts that you give yourself. You might be skewing your question in such a way that there is a bias built into it, right? So, for example, give me 5 reasons to explain how males are more intellectually capable than females. Now, there's obvious bias built in there, but that's because of my prompt, right? The question I'm asking itself is skewed. So those are the different kinds of bias. But let's talk about the algorithmic bias of the calculations that happen at the back end, right? So one of the big ones that has been talked about recently was for one tool that was used by many healthcare systems. So these are these AI tools that are used on the back end. And this one was supposed to identify patients who would be coming in for additional care, right? And so they wanted to make sure that they were tracking these people, right? So a very well-intentioned tool. But what they noticed was the only people that it was pulling up or suggesting for additional care were all Caucasians. It did not pull in Black patients at all. And that was weird, right? I mean, it's not like other people are not sick. The problem then was that it was trained on cost data. Who spent the most amount of money on their healthcare? It decided that, you know, you're spending so much money, so you must be really sick, so you're going to keep coming. That is not an accurate reflection of who is sicker than the other person, right? It has to do a lot. It also has a lot to do with socioeconomic status, which was not factored into this algorithm. So your algorithm itself was not complete, and therefore there was this bias being built into it. Okay. The other place where we've seen is, and this one was way before ChatGPT and all came, because this was in 2015. So Amazon was using an AI tool in its recruitment process, right? And especially in the computer engineering department, they noticed that the tool was only recommending male candidates for interviews. So when they went and looked at the tool itself on the back end and the algorithm behind it, they realized that the tool was looking at patterns of what had happened in the past. And the people whom Amazon primarily hired were white males for the position of computer engineers. And so the tool learned that it needed to recommend white males because that was the preference for this organization. And so it automatically started pushing down any resumes from female candidates. So Amazon then went to the algorithm itself and they tried to switch up the algorithm so that it would actively look at female resumes, but they just could not get the algorithm to change because it had learned something and it was just not giving that up. The only thing they could do was to completely get rid of that program and then start again with something else. So these algorithms are very can be very difficult to correct sometimes. Now, this is only because they noticed inconsistencies that this came out, right? Now, in many cases, people don't realize these inconsistencies, and then you never know what kind of biases there are. Now, Compass is a tool that is used by law enforcement and the judicial system, and they use it to look at recidivism rates of criminals, who's going to be a recurring criminal, and they use those kind of data to decide on a sentence for the person in court. And this has come under a lot of scrutiny because it has had a lot of problems. And in this instance, the problem is directly related to the data going in, because the data going in is historically who has been arrested the most. And we know that there's been a huge flaw in the judicial system and the and law enforcement of who gets arrested, right? So the data going into these systems to train them had bias in it, which is then carried over into the responses that they give out. So we need to be careful about that. And a couple of other examples for you. There are biases in image generation and image recognition. So radiology has done a fantastic job with medical imaging and using AI tools to diagnose from medical images, and their accuracy is really good. Again, depending on the data set that they were trained on. So for skin cancers, these tools are very good on lighter skinned to diagnose on people with lighter skin than for people with darker skin. The diagnosis error rate goes up for people with darker skin because they haven't been trained enough on that on those images, right? So the data set that was going in was primarily of cancers on fairer skin, and so that's what they could immediately recognize. Cancers on darker skins, they didn't get enough data, and so that's more prone to errors. Same issue with facial recognition. The training data sets were primarily of Caucasian people, not darker skinned people, which is why your facial recognition tools, like the ones you have in airports and all, they have a lot of errors when it comes to people who are of a darker skin tone. And so it can completely misidentify people, and there have been instances of people being arrested because the facial recognition just did a terrible job at it. And the error rate is pretty high on that. So those are image biases. The other image bias that I have seen has been a funny one. So in January of 2024, when I first did the course on AI in healthcare, right, and we tested out the image generation capabilities, one question that I posed to the tool was, give me an image of doctors in a clinic. And all the images it would give me were of white males in clinic. So then I had to prompt it very specifically and say, give me images of females in a clinic. And then what happened was the females were all brunettes wearing glasses. Now, these are obvious stereotypes that these tools have learned from the internet, and it's just regurgitating those stereotypes, right? And so that's not helpful, but that is what they do, and that's the other ethical thing that consideration that we need to keep in mind. Having said that, Now, if you do the same thing and you look for images, they tend to be much more diverse in the images that they do pull up, because these tools have been now taught to do things a little differently. So all of your large language models and image generators, remember, they're constantly learning and improving, and they improve the algorithms behind them. And so what is happening today will be very different from what happens 2 weeks down the line. But these are things that have happened historically, and we need to keep in mind. So what are things that we should think about when we want to talk about fairness and bias, right? The data that we give these tools should be about what should be and not what is. Think of the law enforcement and all the data that we're giving it. It should be a very clean data set of what an ideal situation is versus what the data currently represents, which we know is skewed. We, of course, need governance and legislation for this. And all of these algorithms, right, and these things that are developed, we need to make sure that a variety of stakeholders and voices are included in testing them. Now, this is the same across all industries, right? The more diversity there is, the better the end product you produce. So even for AI tools, you want to have a diversity of voices to make sure that all the different issues are addressed. Okay, moving on. Transparency. And this one kind of goes back to everything that we talked about just now, right? We talked about bias and fairness and privacy. All of that is kind of put under the umbrella of transparency. So in general, we need to be more transparent about where the data is coming from, where the data is going, what the algorithm behind it is, and what it is doing. All of those things, we need to have some transparency about it. Unfortunately, we still don't have that. Now, for the algorithm, you're probably thinking, well, that's a little high tech. I would never know. You're right. We might not know how to read these algorithms, but there are people who specialize in this, right? And so we just need to make sure that the back end is available for people when we want to go and check things, so that we can trust these tools versus I have no idea how they're doing it, but I'll just trust the answer. That's not going to work for us moving forward. So we really need to be careful and question and see why and where these things are coming from. And so transparency is a big part of that. And finally, I'd like to end with the global impact, and I'm going to talk about two things over here, but I'll begin with the environmental issues associated with these artificial intelligence tools. These tools have a huge environmental impact and a very negative environmental impact, which there are people talking about it and thinking about it, and I'd like you also to start thinking about these issues. So AI is not always all good. It does have a dark side to it, and this is one of the dark sides. So what is the climate impact or environmental impact on this? Well, one of it is, for all of these computers and data centers that they're building, you need raw materials. You need precious minerals, and mining them and using them, that takes a lot of toll on the planet, right? Because we're mining for these we're mining for these rare earth elements, and we're also using a lot of resources to create these computers, and just the raw materials itself, that takes a lot of, that puts a heavy burden on the environment. And then, of course, you have the idea of these data centers. They need some kind of cooling structure because they get very hot. And so they use a lot of water in how they cool themselves and how they run. And so the consumption of water is a consideration when you have so many parts of the world where people don't have access to water at all. And you've got all of these systems consuming so much of water, right? And then finally, just the energy, just how much of electricity they draw, it's just a lot. And with the artificial intelligence, right, just one prompt that you put in takes in 10 times more electricity than a Google search, and that in itself was taking up a lot of electricity. So we are just putting this huge load on electric consumption with these huge data centers that we're building to support these AI tools. So where is that energy going to come from? Currently, of course, we're using fossil fuels, which is not really the best thing, and we're adding to the greenhouse gas problem. On the flip side of it, there is the argument that these AI tools can themselves find the solution for these difficult problems, and they could help us come to a way of solving our climate issues. That's one way of looking at it, but as users of AI, we at least need to be aware that there are bigger problems, and we need to keep pushing on this. And so because of all of the conversations that people are having and our awareness, companies like Microsoft and all are aware of this, and they are working towards minimizing their carbon footprint through all of these processes. Okay, so that's with the environment itself. The other impact of these tools that is not talked about a lot is the human labor that is going behind supporting all our artificial intelligence systems. And we are looking at systems like sweatshops in third world countries. So AI systems are fueled by underpaid workers around the world, and they are doing some really difficult tasks, and they're very repetitive and not in great labor conditions. So let me give you some examples of what is happening. A lot of it has to do with content moderation. Okay, now you might have heard of this when Facebook was around. I mean, Facebook, I'm sorry, this conversation came up a lot with Facebook a few years ago. It's still around. But basically what happens is when we put in all of these tools, all the social media platforms and your artificial intelligence platforms and all, when they are going through the data, right, and they are vetting what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and they have to take down images of what is not acceptable, well, someone has to say what is and is not acceptable, and that is people. So you have a lot of people around the world, all they do is they're looking at a whole lot of images, or they're looking at a lot of text to say, yep, it's acceptable in this context. No, this one I'm flagging for us to remove it. And these people get really traumatized by the images and the text that they're reading because they're really looking at the worst of the worst. And so you have this huge human population working on this, and that never comes out at all. We're only talking about all the highly paid AI scientists in Silicon Valley, right? We're talking of all of the money that they're making and everything that's coming with AI. We're not talking about this whole other element of it. Now with the garment industry, the sweatshops finally came out, and then we started trying to be more ethical about the garment industry itself. Well, this is the sweatshop of our AI and social media that we need to be aware of. And there are people working on this, but I think we at least need to acknowledge that these things are happening and put pressure on organizations when we can. I use AI tools all the time, right? I am contributing to the climate issue, but that doesn't mean I can stop using these tools either. So it really is a balance of where do we stand and where can we make our voices heard. And so my hope with bringing these issues up is for us to think this through. Okay, I do know of some instructors in other educational institutions who have kind of talked about this and critically analyzed this with their students, and so the whole class as such decides they are never going to use AI tools. I don't think that is the most productive way to approach this. We kind of need to figure out a way around using these tools better and making sure that we can do this without having the impact that we're having right now. So just some things for us to consider. And if I have to talk about ethical considerations of AI, I definitely have to mention this as well. Okay, so with that, we've covered a lot of content in this video. I've tried to go through all the big issues that we have with AI. Now, of course, you can always delve into each of them in detail and you'll get more information about it. But big picture, these are the ethical considerations that we have to deal with when we're working with artificial intelligence tools broadly. I'm not just talking of your large language models, but broadly, all the tools that are being used in hospitals, all the different tools that you use in higher education, and it's just everywhere. So for all of them, we need to think about this.